In the final desperate winter of World War II, the conflict was supposed to be winding down. The German war machine was battered and retreating on all fronts, but Adolf Hitler had one last, insane gamble to play. A thunderous surprise offensive through the frozen Ardennes forest, aimed at shattering the Allied lines and forcing a negotiated peace. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, a fight defined by brutal winter conditions and incredible heroism. But hidden inside this epic struggle is another story. The story of a top-secret piece of technology, an artillery shell so advanced it had never been used on a battlefield before. And it's the story of an American colonel who, facing annihilation, would defy direct orders to unleash this weapon, changing not just the course of the battle, but the very nature of warfare itself. On December 16, 1944, Hitler unleashed his final gamble. American soldiers in the Ardennes were outgunned, outnumbered, and caught completely by surprise. The earth trembled under the weight of hundreds of panzer tanks. But on one critical sector of the front, an American colonel was about to make a decision that would echo through history. He was about to defy a direct order from the highest levels of command and unleash a weapon so secret the Germans wouldn't know what hit them. For soldiers who had survived years of war by digging in, their foxholes were about to become their graves. This is the story of the intelligent shell that broke Hitler's last army and changed warfare forever. By late 1944, the Allies were sure the end was in sight. After D-Day and the breakout from Normandy, their armies had pushed all the way to the German border. The front lines had settled along a quiet, forested region called the Ardennes. This sector was considered so unsuited for a major attack that it was used as a rest area for exhausted American troops and a training ground for new ones. That was exactly the weakness Hitler planned to exploit. He gathered the last of his reserves, over 200,000 soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks, for a massive surprise attack codenamed Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious. Smash through the thin American lines, race to the Meuse River, and then seize the critical port of Antwerp. Capturing Antwerp would cut off supply lines for nearly a third of the Allied forces, trapping them and, in Hitler's mind, forcing a surrender. The attack was launched under the cover of the worst winter weather in decades. Thick fog and heavy snow grounded the Allies' single greatest advantage: their total air supremacy. On the ground, the German assault was overwhelming. Elite SS Panzer divisions, spearheaded by monstrous Tiger II tanks, slammed into unsuspecting American infantry. The U.S. 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions were shattered in the opening hours, with thousands killed or captured. The situation was dire. Communications were cut. Units were surrounded. A massive bulge began to form in the American lines as German spearheads pushed deeper and deeper. For the GIs in their frozen foxholes, it seemed like an unstoppable tide. They were facing veteran German troops, experts in winter warfare. The trees of the Ardennes, which should have offered cover, now seemed to only mask the enemy's advance. Every report reaching Allied high command painted a picture of chaos and impending disaster. The Allies were facing their greatest crisis on the Western Front since 1940. They needed a miracle. Unbeknownst to almost everyone, that miracle was sitting in ammunition depots just behind the front lines, locked away under the highest secrecy. 4 pivotal projects are often credited with ensuring Allied victory: breaking the Enigma code, the development of radar, and the atomic bomb. But there was a 4th. A project so secret, its budget was one of the largest of the war, costing over $1 billion 1940s, a staggering sum. It involved the collective genius of America's brightest scientific minds at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. It was called the VT fuse, for variable time, a deliberately vague name to hide its true purpose. Today, we know it as the Proximity Fuze. The concept was simple, but its execution was a feat of engineering. For centuries, artillery shells had two ways of going off: on impact or with a timer. Impact fuses were useless against troops in cover. Timed fuses, meant to create airbursts over enemy positions, were better in theory, but incredibly difficult to use. They required precise calculations, and a small error could make the shell explode hundreds of feet too high or bury itself in the mud. The Proximity Fuze was designed to solve this problem with breathtaking ingenuity. Inside the nose of each shell was a marvel of miniaturization, a tiny, self-contained radar set. It had a radio transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, a battery, and an explosive trigger. Once fired, the fuse would start emitting radio waves. As the shell neared its target, the waves would bounce off the ground, and when the reflected signal reached a specific intensity, indicating the shell was at the perfect altitude, usually between 30 and 50 feet, it would detonate the main charge. The result was a perfect airburst every single time, without any complex math from the gun crew. It turned a normal artillery shell into an intelligent weapon. An airburst was dramatically more lethal than a ground burst, spraying a wide cone of steel shrapnel capable of reaching soldiers in trenches and foxholes. The technical challenges were immense. The team had to build electronics that could survive being fired from a cannon. The components, including tiny vacuum tubes, had to withstand the shock of 20,000 times the force of gravity and the violent spin of the shell. The batteries had to be designed so that the force of the launch itself would shatter a small glass vial, allowing the electrolyte to activate the power source. It was a billion-dollar gamble on technology many believed was impossible. By 1944, American industry was churning out tens of thousands of these fuses a day. But they came with a strict order. The fuse was to be used only over water as an anti-aircraft weapon. The reason was secrecy. If a dud was recovered by the Germans, they might reverse engineer it. The fear was that Germany could quickly create its own version and use it against Allied bombers, or worse, have it ready for the D-Day invasion. General Eisenhower later said that if the Germans had this weapon at Normandy, the invasion might have been exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. So, while the Navy used the fuses with spectacular success in the Pacific and against V-1 flying bombs over Britain, the Army's crates remained off-limits for ground combat, waiting for an emergency so dire that the risk of compromise was worth it. That emergency was about to arrive. On the northern shoulder of the German attack stood the town of Monschau. Holding this critical anchor of the American line was a small reconnaissance unit, the 38th Cavalry Squadron. Supporting them was the 406th Field Artillery Group, commanded by Colonel Oscar Axelson, a career artilleryman who understood the brutal math of his trade. He also understood the orders he'd been given about the new funny fuse shells, codenamed Posit. The restrictions were absolute. Do not use them unless authorized by the highest command. On the morning of December 16th, Axelson's world exploded. The German 326th Volksgrenadier Division slammed into the cavalry's thin lines. The calls for fire support grew desperate. The Germans were advancing in huge numbers, using the fog to their advantage. Axelson's gunners fired conventional shells, but the well-trained Germans would just hit the ground, wait for the barrage to pass, and then get up and continue their relentless advance. Axelson faced an impossible choice. His position was about to be overrun. and the men on the front line faced annihilation. Following his orders meant accepting a catastrophic defeat. Breaking those orders meant risking a court-martial and handing America's most important military secret to the enemy. As the reports grew more frantic, Axelson made his decision. He judged that the immediate crisis, the collapse of his sector, outweighed the potential compromise of the fuse. He picked up the field telephone and gave the order. It went against everything he had been told, a direct violation of a directive from Allied Supreme Headquarters. He ordered his gun crews to load the POZIT shells. He was gambling his career and a billion-dollar secret on the belief that this weapon could stop the German assault in its tracks. The men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, confident in their attack, were about to walk into a storm of steel unlike anything they had ever experienced. The first salvos of proximity-fused shells were supersonic, arcing invisibly through the snowy air. For the advancing German infantry, there was no warning whistle, just the cataclysmic crack of explosions directly over their heads. The effect was apocalyptic. Instead of hitting the ground, the shells detonated about 30 to 50 feet in the air, raining thousands of lethal steel fragments downwards. Veteran German soldiers, conditioned to dive into foxholes to survive artillery, found their instincts had become a death sentence. Cover was now useless. The shrapnel tore through them from above, penetrating foxholes and shallow trenches with ease. The very air had turned against them. The attack simply evaporated. Formations that had been advancing with discipline were shredded in seconds. Survivors were gripped by a terror they had never known. They had faced artillery for years, but this was something that seemed almost supernatural. There was no way to defend against it. The German assault on Monschau collapsed. The psychological impact was profound. German prisoners spoke of a new, horrifying Allied weapon, unable to understand how the Americans were achieving such perfect airbursts in a blizzard. Axelson's gamble had paid off spectacularly. Though his decision caused a crisis in the high command, the results were impossible to argue with. On December 21st, General Eisenhower officially lifted the ban. The floodgates opened. 200,000 proximity-fused shells were rushed to artillery units all across the Ardennes. The story of Monschau was repeated across the front. In the besieged town of Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne used the fuses to shatter wave after wave of German attacks, supported by artillery units like the African-American 969th Field Artillery Battalion. On Christmas Day, General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was racing to relieve Bastogne, witnessed the fuse's power firsthand. Near the Sauer River, a German battalion was caught in the open. Patton watched in awe as over 700 German soldiers were killed in minutes. The forest itself, once a German advantage, became a death trap. The airbursts hit the treetops, creating a secondary explosion of wooden splinters that rained down on the soldiers below, compounding the lethality of the shrapnel. One officer reported that the bodies of a German patrol hit by a proximity fuse barrage looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. The introduction of the proximity fuse was a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. This channel is all about uncovering these pivotal moments in history. So, if you enjoy deep dives into the secret weapons and untold stories of the past, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments. What other secret weapon of World War II do you think deserves its own story? The widespread deployment of the proximity fuse fundamentally changed the battlefield. For the first 5 days of the offensive, the Germans used the terrible weather to their advantage. The proximity fuse stole that advantage back. Suddenly, darkness and fog were no longer a sanctuary. American artillery could now fire with devastating accuracy at unseen targets, day or night. For the German soldier, the psychological toll was immense. The battlefield no longer had safe spaces. The sound of incoming artillery, once a signal to take cover, now heralded an unavoidable curtain of death. Morale plummeted. Troops began to refuse orders to advance into areas covered by American artillery. German intelligence, despite capturing some duds, failed to grasp the technology. Their own scientists had considered the idea of a proximity fuse, but had dismissed it as technically impossible during the war, a belief that left their troops completely unprepared. The fuse was an incredible force multiplier. It's estimated that proximity-fused shells were responsible for thousands of German casualties during the battle. For an army already stretched to its breaking point, this level of attrition was unsustainable. General George S. Patton became one of the fuse's biggest proponents. After witnessing its effects, he wrote a letter to the Chief of Army Ordnance. In his famously blunt style, Patton declared, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." He added, "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." He was right. The age of simply digging a hole for protection was over. The fuse's impact went beyond just inflicting casualties. It broke the momentum of the German offensive. Elite units that had spearheaded the attack were stalled or decimated. By turning the Germans' greatest assets, the cover of the forests and the bad weather, into liabilities, the proximity fuse helped stabilize the front and gave the Allies the time they needed to regroup and launch the counteroffensive that would ultimately destroy the last of Hitler's armored reserves. The Battle of the Bulge ended in a decisive Allied victory, but at a terrible cost. It was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. In the final analysis, it was a battle won not only by the courage of the soldiers, but also by the genius of the scientists. The proximity fuse stands as one of the most significant, yet least known, technological triumphs of the war. Its development was a monumental achievement, a secret kept so well that its debut on the battlefield came as a complete and devastating shock. It saved countless Allied lives, first by defending ships from air attack, and then by shattering German ground forces at the most critical moment of the war in Europe. The legacy of that colonel's decision on December 16, 1944, extends far beyond the Ardennes. Colonel Axelson's gamble unleashed a weapon that not only helped win the battle, but also heralded a new age of warfare. The proximity fuse was, in essence, the world's first smart weapon. The miniaturized, rugged electronics developed for it laid the fundamental groundwork for the entire field of modern guided munitions that defines the battlefields of today. The story of the funny fuse is a powerful reminder that history often turns on single moments of innovation and on the courage of individuals willing to take a risk in impossible circumstances. It's the story of how a tiny, intelligent device, unleashed at the perfect moment, made the frozen earth tremble, broke the back of Hitler's last army, and forever changed the way wars are fought. In the savage, grinding battles of World War II, Germany unleashed its steel predators onto the fields of Europe, the Tiger and the Panther. These weren't just tanks. They were legends forged in Krupp steel, armored titans designed to be perfect, invincible killers. Their guns could pick off Allied tanks from distances the Allies couldn't hope to match. Their armor was so thick that most opposing shells would just shatter against it. On paper, they were the pinnacle of tank design, the ultimate expression of Germany's engineering genius. They were, in a word, perfect. But this isn't a story about perfection. This is a story about how perfection lost. It's the story of how these seemingly invincible beasts were systematically hunted down and destroyed by a flood of what many considered inferior American tanks. Tanks that were thinner, weaker, and sometimes derided by their own crews. This is the story of the M4 Sherman, a tank that earned the grim post-war nickname Ronson because it supposedly had a tendency to light up after a single hit. So, how did this happen? How did a bad tank manage to defeat Germany's best? The answer isn't found in the thickness of the steel or the caliber of the gun. It has nothing to do with horsepower or muzzle velocity. The answer lies in a revolutionary piece of technology that Germany tragically overlooked. It was a device that allowed a pack of wolves to systematically dismantle a bear, proving once and for all that in modern warfare, brute force is no match for a perfect network. This is the story of how a simple radio, installed in every single American tank, changed the face of warfare forever. To understand the revolution, you first have to understand the myth. And that myth begins with the Panzerkampfwagen 6, better known as the Tiger. When the Tiger first appeared on the Eastern Front in late 1942, it was more than just a new weapon. It was a psychological shockwave. Allied soldiers, used to fighting smaller Panzer IIIs and IVs, were suddenly confronted with a 56-ton monster that seemed to defy the very laws of tank combat. The Tiger's whole reason for being came from the brutal lessons Germany learned during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. There, they ran into the Soviet T-34 and K-51 tanks, whose sloped armor and powerful guns outclassed anything the Wehrmacht had. That shock led to a demand for a new breed of heavy tank, a Durchbruchswagen, or breakthrough vehicle, that could dominate any opponent. The Tiger was the answer. Its heart was the legendary 88mm KWK-36 gun. Originally an anti-aircraft gun, the 88 had already proven devastating against Allied armor. Mounted in the Tiger's turret, it was a weapon of incredible accuracy and power. It could slice through the front of an M4 Sherman from well over 1,000 yards away, a distance where the Sherman's own 75mm gun was basically useless against the Tiger's front. For an Allied tanker, seeing a Tiger was terrifying. You were in its kill zone long before it was in yours. This fearsome firepower was matched by equally formidable armor. The Tiger I boasted 100mm of solid frontal armor. While later designs would emphasize sloping for better protection, the sheer thickness of the Tiger's steel was enough to defeat most Allied anti-tank guns of the time. Shells would often bounce harmlessly off its hide, a demoralizing ping that signaled the crew's own impending doom. Then came its younger, sleeker sibling, the Panther. If the Tiger was a heavyweight brawler, the Panther was a modern predator. Learning from the Soviet T-34, the Panther incorporated superbly sloped frontal armor, which made it incredibly tough to penetrate. It was armed with a long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun, a weapon arguably even more potent than the Tiger's 88 at long ranges. Together, the Tiger and Panther represented the core of German tank philosophy: qualitative superiority. The belief was that a single, perfectly engineered tank, crewed by an elite team, could destroy multiple lesser enemy tanks. German tank crews were trained to be master marksmen, patient hunters who would pick their shots from afar. Aces like Michael Wittmann became legends, their kill counts mounting into the hundreds, seemingly proving the doctrine right. But this pursuit of perfection came at a staggering cost. These tanks were engineering marvels, but they were also nightmarishly complex and over-engineered. This made them incredibly difficult and slow to build. For every one Tiger tank that rolled off the assembly line, the Allies could produce dozens of Shermans. Their weight and complexity also made them a logistical nightmare. The Tiger was so heavy, it struggled with many European bridges. It guzzled fuel at an astronomical rate, with a combat range of barely 60 kilometers in rough terrain. Mechanical breakdowns were constant and severe. While the exact numbers are debated by historians, a staggering number of Tigers were abandoned and destroyed by their own crews due to transmission failures, engine problems, or simply running out of gas. Germany had built the perfect dueling weapon, but in doing so, they had sown the seeds of their own defeat. They had created a tank that was brilliant in a one-on-one fight, but was completely unprepared for the new kind of war that was coming. On the other side of the equation stood the American M4 Sherman. If the Tiger was a meticulously crafted rapier, the Sherman was a mass-produced cudgel. It wasn't designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to be the tank America could build, ship, and maintain in overwhelming numbers. Its design was a compromise, a balance of firepower, armor, mobility, and, most importantly, reliability and ease of production. The Sherman's main gun for much of the war was a 75mm M3. It was a decent multi-purpose weapon, great against infantry and the lighter German tanks it was first meant to fight. But against the front of a Panther or a Tiger, it was almost useless at normal combat ranges. Sherman crews had to try and get on the flank of the German Cats, a risky move that often exposed them to the enemy's main gun. Even later, Shermans with a more powerful 76mm gun struggled to reliably punch through the Panther's sloped front. Its armor was also a concern. The Sherman's frontal armor just wasn't in the same league as the German heavyweights, making it vulnerable to their guns from almost any angle and at almost any range. This vulnerability led to a grim reputation. A persistent myth that popped up after the war was that the Sherman was nicknamed the Ronson, after the lighter brand, with the tagline, "Lights first time, every time." Now, there's no concrete evidence this nickname was actually used during the war. The ad slogan it's based on didn't even show up until the 1950s. But the sentiment behind the myth points to a real problem. Early Shermans stored ammunition on the sides of the hull. A penetrating hit there had a high chance of igniting the ammo, leading to a catastrophic fire. The U.S. Army saw this was a huge problem and quickly moved to fix it. The solution was wet stowage, moving the ammunition to the floor and surrounding it with a water-glycerin mixture to douse any sparks from a hit. This innovation dramatically increased crew survivability. Studies showed the chance of a catastrophic fire from a penetration dropped from over 60% down to around 15%. But the reputation, deserved or not, stuck. America's philosophy of war, however, was totally different from Germany's. Where Germany prized quality, America prized quantity and logistics. The United States, with its vast industrial base safe from bombing, could crank out tanks on a scale the Third Reich could only dream of. Nearly 50,000 Shermans were produced during the war. For every Panther, the U.S. produced more than 8 Shermans. For every Tiger, more than 30. This industrial might was paired with an obsession with reliability. The Sherman was powered by a dependable engine and designed to be easily repaired in the field. A damaged Tiger often had to be sent all the way back to a factory, but a broken-down Sherman could frequently be fixed overnight by its own crew. This meant a much higher percentage of American tanks were actually ready for combat on any given day. The inferior Sherman was simply there on the front line, ready to fight. This led to a completely different doctrine. Americans knew they couldn't win a one-on-one duel with a Panther or Tiger, so they didn't try. Doctrine called for platoons of 5 Shermans to operate as a team. If they met a German heavy, the plan wasn't to slug it out. Instead, they'd use their numbers and mobility to encircle the lone predator. 1 or 2 Shermans would act as bait, firing from the front to get the Germans' attention. The other tanks would then use that moment to speed around to the weaker flanks and rear. It was a dangerous tactic, but it worked. It was the doctrine of a pack of wolves against a bear. The bear might be stronger, but the pack was smarter and better coordinated. And that coordination was about to get a massive boost from a secret weapon. The clash between the Sherman and the Tiger was more than a clash of steel. It was a clash of philosophies. On one side, you had the German doctrine of the perfect weapon. On the other, the American doctrine of the perfect system. The German philosophy was rooted in a kind of technological elitism. They believed a superior tank could overcome superior numbers. The tank commander was seen as a lone hunter, a master of his craft. Communication, in this model, was secondary. It was hierarchical and rigid. German tanks were typically equipped with the Fuze 5 radio, an AM radio that was notoriously susceptible to static and interference from the tank's own engine. But even worse, the system wasn't designed for a network of equals. In a typical panzer company, only the commander's tank might have a full transceiver, a radio that could both send and receive messages. The rest of the tanks often just had receivers. They could hear orders, but they couldn't talk back. They couldn't report what they were seeing or warn a buddy of a threat. Communication became a one-way street from the top down. If the commander's tank was knocked out, the rest of the unit was often left deaf and dumb, forced to rely on flags or hand signals. In the smoke and chaos of a firefight, these methods were hopelessly inadequate. German panzer units, for all their individual skill, often fought as a collection of isolated individuals rather than a cohesive team. The American philosophy was the complete opposite. The U.S. Army understood that a tank was not just a weapon. It was a node in a much larger combat network. The goal wasn't to build the single best tank, but to build the best combined arms war machine. And at the heart of this doctrine was a piece of technology that was light years ahead of what the Germans were using: the SCR-508 radio. Developed by Motorola, the SCR-508 was a game-changer. It was an FM radio, which provided a crystal-clear, static-free signal. A Sherman crew could communicate with a clarity that was simply impossible for their German counterparts. But the real revolution wasn't just the tech, it was the doctrine. The American plan was radical. Put a radio in everything. Every single M4 Sherman came with a full SCR-508 transceiver. Every tank commander could talk, and every tank commander could listen. Suddenly, the tank platoon was no longer a group of individuals following a leader. It was a five-man team, all sharing information in real time. The SCR-508 even included an intercom system for the crew and had 10 preset channels, letting a commander easily switch between his platoon, his company, or even a net for calling in artillery or air support. This created a level of situational awareness that was unheard of. A Sherman on the flank could spot an anti-tank gun and instantly warn everyone. A platoon leader could direct his tanks with verbal commands, like a quarterback calling a play. And because artillery and tank destroyer units also had compatible FM radios, the response to a call for help was terrifyingly fast, often under 5 minutes. A response time the Germans couldn't hope to match. This was the turning point. Germany focused on the hardware of the individual tank. America focused on the software of the system. The Germans were still thinking in terms of duels. The Americans were thinking in terms of an integrated, information-driven network. It was brute force versus network. Let's take a second to truly appreciate the technological gulf between these armies. It wasn't a small gap, it was a chasm. Imagine you're playing a fast-paced online team strategy game. Team Germany has individually skilled players with powerful characters, but their communication is flawed. Only the team leader has a microphone. Everyone else can only listen. If the leader gets taken out first, the team falls apart. Now, imagine Team America. Their individual characters might not be as powerful, but every single player has a crystal-clear, lag-free headset. They are in constant communication, calling out enemy positions, coordinating attacks, and focusing their fire. Which team do you think wins? This is basically the difference between the German and American armored forces. The German Fuze was a 10-watt, AM-based system. Trying to decipher orders through the constant static and engine noise was a nightmare. The effective range for voice chat between two moving tanks was often as little as a mile. And since only command tanks usually had a full transceiver, the average Panzer crewman was just a passive listener. German reports often noted the impressive coordination of American units, but mistakenly chalked it up to rigid training, never grasping that the Americans were simply talking to each other. The American SCR-508, by contrast, was a 25-watt FM system. It was more powerful, clearer, and far more resistant to interference. Its typical range for tank-to-tank voice communication was consistently around 2 to 5 miles, allowing American units to coordinate over much larger areas. The system was designed for networking from the ground up. Inside the Sherman, each crew member was connected to an intercom. The tank commander had a switch. In one position, he could talk to his crew. With a flip of that switch, his voice was broadcast to the entire platoon. This created a shared consciousness, a hive mind that could react to battlefield changes with astonishing speed. The numbers tell the story. The U.S. produced over 50,000 sets of the SCR-508 family of radios, enough for every Sherman to have a full transceiver. In contrast, while precise figures are hard to come by, estimates suggest Germany produced far fewer transceivers for its tank force, meaning a large portion of their tanks could only listen. This American communication network extended beyond just the tanks. Tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and command vehicles were all on the same FM net. This allowed for seamless combined arms. A Sherman platoon pinned down by a Tiger could radio for help, and a nearby platoon of M10 tank destroyers could be vectored in. An infantry commander could direct a Sherman's fire onto a machine gun nest holding up his advance. This technological superiority was a force multiplier. It made every Sherman more valuable than its specs would suggest. It transformed a collection of bad tanks into a cohesive, intelligent, and lethal fighting system. The Germans had built a better tank. The Americans had built a better army. February 1943. The desolate Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. Here, the untested American army would get its first major thrashing of the European war. The Battle of Kasserine Pass is often remembered as a humiliating defeat, a moment where green American troops were run over by Rommel's battle-hardened Afrika Korps. And it was. But it was also the bloody crucible, where the American army learned the lessons that would turn its technological advantage into real battlefield dominance. Going into the battle, the Americans were confident. They had the numbers, the industrial might, and their revolutionary FM radios. On paper, they should have done well. But battles aren't fought on paper. The American Second Corps was led by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a commander who set up his command post in a bomb-proof bunker 70 miles behind the front lines. He rarely left. He broke up his divisions, scattering units across a wide front. There was no cohesion or mutual support. Into this mess smashed the German 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions. The Germans, with their veteran crews and superior tanks, immediately exploited the American weaknesses, punching through the thin lines and isolating one unit after another. This is the moment where the American radio network should have been a game changer. It should have allowed the scattered American units to coordinate a defense and call for help. But it didn't. The problem wasn't the technology. It was the training, or lack thereof. The American Army hadn't yet learned how to use its incredible communication system. The clear, static-free FM signals simply carried messages of confusion and panic. Units didn't know who to call or what to say. The perfect communication network was useless because the organization was a chaotic mess. The Germans, despite their inferior radios, were operating under a unified command with a clear plan. Kasserine Pass was an unmitigated disaster. It was a brutal lesson that technology alone doesn't win battles. You can have the best radio in the world, but if your leadership is poor, your doctrine is flawed, and your troops are green, you will lose. But the American Army, unlike the German Army, was a learning institution. It was capable of ruthless self-assessment. The shock of Kasserine reverberated all the way to the top. General Eisenhower was furious. The defeat, he knew, was a failure of leadership and organization. And the changes came swiftly. The aftermath of Kasserine Pass was a moment of reckoning. The defeat triggered a wholesale purge of ineffective commanders and a complete overhaul of American doctrine. Lloyd Fredendall was out. His replacement was a brash, aggressive commander who perfectly embodied the new approach America needed. General George S. Patton. Patton was a true believer in mobile warfare, and he immediately saw the potential of the communication tools he had. He and other new leaders like General Omar Bradley drilled their troops relentlessly on the fundamentals of combined arms warfare. Tanks, infantry, and artillery working as a seamless team. And the radio was the thread that stitched it all together. Training exercises forced commanders to use their radios effectively. They practiced flanking maneuvers, with commanders directing their tanks with crisp voice commands. They drilled on calling for artillery, cutting the response time from a disastrous half-hour to a life-saving 3 minutes. The lessons paid for in blood at Kasserine were being turned into institutional knowledge. Slowly but surely, the American Army transformed from a collection of units into a true fighting network. And as they pushed into Sicily, Italy, and stormed the beaches of Normandy, this new way of war began to show its power. The true test came during the breakout from Normandy. In September 1944, at the Battle of Aricourt, the U.S. 4th Armored Division clashed with German panzer brigades equipped with the formidable Panther tank. On paper, the Germans had the advantage, but the battle was a rout. American Shermans, using their superior radio coordination, acted like an intelligent swarm. Tank commanders instantly reported Panther positions. Tank destroyers were fed targeting info from tanks they couldn't even see. Artillery observers in Sherman command tanks called down devastating fire within minutes. Though exact numbers are debated in the fog of war, the 4th Armored Division destroyed hundreds of German armored vehicles for a fraction of their own losses, achieving a staggering kill ratio that defied the technical specs of the tanks involved. This was the American war machine in full flight. It wasn't about one Sherman dueling one Panther. It was about an entire system. Dozens of tanks, tank destroyers, artillery batteries, and fighter bombers, all linked by the invisible web of the FM radio, descending on an isolated and out-of-touch enemy. The Germans, with their crackling AM radios and rigid command structure, just couldn't react fast enough. They were fighting yesterday's war. The Sherman tank, the supposedly bad tank, had found its purpose. It wasn't a duelist, it was a node. Its greatest strength wasn't its gun or its armor, but the antenna sticking out of its turret. That simple steel whip connected it to a vast network of information, transforming it from a vulnerable target into a vital part of an unstoppable organism. The story of the Sherman and its radio is really the story of the birth of modern warfare. It's a powerful reminder that victory doesn't always go to the side with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It goes to the side that can better gather, share, and act on information. Germany, in its quest for the perfect predator, built a magnificent weapon. The Tiger and the Panther were engineering marvels, and without a doubt, they were better individual tanks than the M4 Sherman. But Germany made a fatal mistake. They perfected the weapon, but neglected the system. They built an army of brilliant, but ultimately isolated soloists. America, on the other hand, built a symphony of violence. They understood that the strength of an army lies in how its parts connect and work together. The M4 Sherman, with its reliability, its numbers, and most importantly, its revolutionary radio, was the perfect instrument for this new kind of warfare. It was the key component in history's first true network-centric fighting force. The clear FM signals passing between thousands of tanks, artillery batteries, and command posts were more devastating than any 88mm shell. They proved that a coordinated pack will always defeat a lone wolf, no matter how strong. So, while the myth of the invincible German supertank persists, the reality is that they were defeated by a better idea. An idea that a connected army is a smarter army. An idea that proved that a radio in a bad tank was more powerful than the thickest steel, changing warfare forever and laying the foundation for the networked battlefields of today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden technologies of World War II, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge the myths of military history. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Let us know in the comments what piece of overlooked military tech you think deserves its own story. Thanks for watching.